The old rocking chair still creaked every evening. Michael sat in it the same way he had for years, facing the distant mountains beyond his backyard in Colorado. The sun was setting. The sky glowed with shades of orange and gold. It was beautiful. At least that's what people always said. But Michael barely noticed anymore. At 68 years old, beauty no longer felt important. Not after everything he had lost. 4 years earlier, his wife Sarah had passed away after a long battle with cancer. Some days, he could still hear her voice. Not clearly, just fragments. A laugh from the kitchen. A gentle reminder to lock the front door. The sound of her footsteps in the hallway. Then silence. The kind of silence that settles into a house and never truly leaves. At first, friends visited often. Neighbors checked on him. His children called regularly. But life has a way of moving forward. People become busy. Grandchildren are born. Jobs demand attention. Months become years. And eventually, everyone returns to their own lives. Everyone except Michael. His mornings had become predictable. Wake up, drink coffee, watch television, eat something simple, wait for the day to end, then do it all again tomorrow. There was no excitement, no purpose, no reason to look forward to anything. What troubled him most was not the loneliness. It was the feeling that he had somehow disappeared. The man he used to be seemed gone. The husband, the father, the provider, the dreamer. All those identities had slowly faded away. And underneath them, Michael no longer knew who he was. One rainy afternoon, he found himself standing in front of a mirror. For a long moment, he stared at the reflection. Gray hair, tired eyes, wrinkles carved by time. A stranger looked back at him, and suddenly a painful question appeared in his mind. When everything I build is gone, who am I? The question followed him for days, then weeks. It lingered in every quiet moment. When he washed dishes, when he sat alone at dinner, when he stared at the ceiling late at night, unable to sleep. Who am I? Not who I was. Not who people expected me to be. Who am I now? One morning, unable to escape the question any longer, Michael climbed into his old pickup truck and began driving. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he couldn't stay where he was. The road carried him through forests, small towns, and winding mountain paths. Hours passed. Clouds drifted across the sky. The farther he drove, the quieter his mind became. Eventually, he reached a narrow road he had never noticed before. A weathered wooden sign stood beside it. The letters were faded, almost unreadable, but one word caught his attention. Temple. Michael frowned. A temple? Out here? Curiosity stirred inside him for the first time in years. Slowly, he turned the truck onto the dirt road. Tall pine trees surrounded him. The noise of the world seemed to disappear. A few minutes later, the trees opened into a small clearing. And there it stood, an old Buddhist temple hidden among the mountains. Simple, quiet, timeless. Michael parked his truck and stepped outside. The air felt different there. Still, almost sacred. He had no idea why he had come. He knew nothing about Buddhism, nothing about meditation, nothing about monks. But something inside him whispered that he was exactly where he needed to be. As he slowly approached the temple gates, an elderly monk appeared from the shadows. The monk smiled gently, not the polite smile of a stranger. The smile of someone who had been expecting him. Before Michael could say a single word, the monk looked directly into his eyes and asked a question. a question so unexpected that it stopped him in his tracks. "Tell me," the monk said softly, "when was the last time you sat alone without trying to escape yourself?" Michael stood frozen, because he did not know the answer, and deep down, for the first time in many years, he realized that perhaps the greatest thing he had lost was not his wife, not his youth, not even his purpose. Perhaps what he had truly lost was himself. The monk waited patiently. Michael searched for an answer, but none came. Instead, an uncomfortable silence settled between them, the kind of silence most people rush to fill. Finally, Michael looked away. "I don't know," he admitted. The monk nodded gently. "That is more honest than most answers." For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind moved softly through the pine trees above them. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out. The world felt strangely calm. The monk gestured toward a stone path leading into the temple grounds. "Walk with me." Michael followed. The temple was smaller than he expected. There were no grand statues, no crowds, no ceremonies. Just a few simple buildings surrounded by trees and gardens. Everything seemed peaceful, painfully peaceful. As they walked, the monk stopped beside a small pond. The surface of the water reflected the clouds perfectly. Then the monk picked up a small stone and dropped it into the center. Ripples spread outward. The reflection disappeared. "What do you see?" the monk asked. "A disturbed pond." The monk smiled. "Exactly." Then he pointed toward Michael's chest. "And what do you carry inside?" Michael laughed bitterly. "Too much." The monk nodded. "Tell me." The words came faster than Michael expected. "About Sarah. About the loneliness. About his children. About growing older. About feeling forgotten. About waking up every day without purpose." Years of buried emotions poured out. The monk listened without interruption. When Michael finally finished, he felt exhausted. The monk looked at him kindly. "Michael, how much of your suffering comes from what happened? And how much comes from wishing it had happened differently?" The question struck him like lightning. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, because deep down, he already knew the answer. Every day, he wished Sarah had lived. Every day, he wished his children called more often. Every day, he wished he were younger, healthier, needed, important. Every day, he fought reality. And every day, reality won. The monk sat down beside the pond. "You are trying to control a river." Michael frowned. "What does that mean?" The monk pointed toward a stream flowing nearby. "Can you stop that water from moving?" "No." "Can you force it to flow backward?" "Of course not." "Can you demand it move faster?" "No." The monk smiled. "Yet every day you demand life do exactly that." Michael stared silently. The monk continued. "You want the past to return. You want people to behave differently. You want life to follow your plans. You want certainty in an uncertain world." The old monk's voice remained gentle. "But life is a river, Michael. The harder you try to control it, the more exhausted you become." For a long moment, Michael watched the water flow. He realized he had spent years fighting things he could never change. Sarah's death, his age, time itself. No wonder he was tired. The monk reached into his robe and pulled out a small handful of sand. He closed his fist tightly. Slowly, grain slipped through his fingers. The tighter he squeezed, the faster the sand disappeared. Then he opened his hand. The remaining sand rested peacefully in his palm. Most people live like this. The monk held up his clenched fist. They hold life too tightly. The tighter they hold, the more they suffer. Then he opened his hand again. But peace comes when you learn to hold life gently. Michael felt something shift inside him. A tiny movement, like ice beginning to melt after a long winter. Not a complete transformation. Not even close. But for the first time in years, he considered a possibility. Maybe peace wasn't something he needed to find. Maybe peace was something hidden beneath all the things he refused to let go. The monk stood. The first lesson is simple. Michael listened carefully. You cannot control life. You can only control how you meet it. The words settled deep inside him. Simple. Yet somehow they felt more powerful than anything he had heard in years. As the sun began to disappear behind the mountains, the monk turned and started walking back toward the temple. Michael remained by the pond, watching the water, watching the ripples fade. And for the first time since Sarah died, he did not ask why life had taken her. He simply sat there, breathing, listening, allowing the river of life to flow exactly as it was. And though his pain remained, something else appeared beside it. A small, unfamiliar feeling. Relief. The journey had only begun. But for the first time in a very long time, Michael felt willing to take the next step. Michael barely slept that night. Not because he was uncomfortable. The small guest room at the temple was simple but peaceful. The mattress was thin. The furniture was old. There was no television, no clock, no phone buzzing with notifications. Nothing. And somehow that nothingness felt louder than any noise he had ever known. For years, Michael had filled every empty space in his life. Television during dinner, radio in the truck, news before bed, background noise while cleaning. Something always had to be playing. Something always had to distract him. Now, there was only silence. And in that silence, thoughts began to surface. Memories he hadn't visited in years. Regrets he had carefully buried. Questions he had avoided. The darkness seemed to pull them all forward. Around 3 a.m, he finally sat up in bed. His chest felt heavy. His mind restless. He wanted to leave. To get in his truck and drive home. To return to the familiar distractions waiting for him. But something stopped him. The monk's words. You cannot control life. You can only control how you meet it. Michael took a deep breath and lay back down. Eventually sleep found him. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window. The temple grounds glowed beneath a clear blue sky. Birds sang among the pine trees. Everything seemed calm. Everything except Michael's mind. After breakfast, he found the monk sweeping fallen leaves from a stone pathway. The old man worked slowly, patiently, as though he had nowhere else to be. Michael approached. I think something is wrong with me. The monk looked up and smiled. Why? I couldn't stop thinking last night. The monk chuckled softly. That is because you finally stopped running. Michael frowned. I don't understand. The monk leaned his broom against a tree. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding themselves. Michael remained silent. The monk continued. They stay busy. They stay entertained. They stay distracted, not because they enjoy it, but because silence frightens them. The words landed harder than Michael expected, because they felt true, painfully true. The monk began walking through the garden. Michael followed. Tell me, the monk said, when Sarah passed away, what did you do? Michael swallowed. I kept busy. Ow! I worked in the garage. I watched television. I stayed occupied. The monk nodded. And when loneliness came, I turned on the television. And when sadness appeared, I found something else to do. The monk stopped walking. Then he looked directly at Michael. So when exactly did you allow yourself to feel it? Michael had no answer, because he never had. For 4 years, he had been surviving, distracting, avoiding, escaping, but never truly grieving, never truly sitting with the pain. The monk pointed toward a wooden bench beneath a large pine tree. Seat. Michael obeyed. The monk sat beside him. For several minutes, neither spoke. At first, Michael felt uncomfortable, then irritated, then restless. His mind searched desperately for something to do. Anything. A conversation, a task, a distraction. But there was nothing, only silence, and himself. Suddenly, he understood why he avoided it. Silence wasn't empty. Silence was a mirror. It reflected everything. Every fear, every wound, every truth. Tears unexpectedly filled his eyes. He looked away, embarrassed, but the monk simply sat there, calm, present, allowing the moment to unfold. Finally, Michael whispered, "I miss her every day." The monk nodded. "I know." The tears came freely now. Not dramatic, not explosive. Just quiet tears that had waited years to fall. The monk spoke softly. "You see." "What?" "You thought the pain would destroy you." Michael listened, but the pain only wanted to be heard. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved gently through the branches above. The world remained still. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Michael stopped fighting his grief. He stopped running. He stopped distracting himself. He simply sat beside it, breathing, feeling, listening. The monk eventually stood. Before leaving, he placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. The second lesson. Michael looked up. The monk smiled gently. Do not fear being alone. Fear spending your whole life disconnected from yourself. Then he walked away, leaving Michael beneath the pine tree. For hours, Michael remained there, watching the sunlight move across the ground, listening to the wind, listening to his own heart. And slowly, beneath years of noise and distraction, he began hearing something he had forgotten existed. His own soul. For the first time in many years, it finally had space to speak. The following morning arrived wrapped in fog. A soft gray mist drifted through the mountains, covering the temple grounds like a blanket. Michael stood alone near the garden. For the first time in years, he wasn't rushing to fill the silence. He simply watched the world wake up. The sound of birds, the movement of leaves, the cool mountain air against his skin. Everything felt slower, softer. Yet deep inside, something still hurt. A wound he had carried for years. A wound he rarely allowed himself to touch. Later that afternoon, the monk invited him to join him beside a small fire near the edge of the forest. They sat quietly, watching the flames dance. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, the monk broke the silence. What is the hardest memory you carry? Michael stared into the fire. Immediately he knew the answer. The hospital room. Even after 4 years, he could see it clearly. The machines, the sterile smell, the dim lighting. Sarah lying in bed, fragile, tired, dying. His chest tightened. The monk noticed. You don't have to tell me. Michael swallowed hard. No. His voice cracked. I think I do. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam finally breaking. He described the final weeks. the treatments, the false hope, the doctor's expression when there was nothing left to try, the day Sarah asked to stop fighting, the day she looked at him and smiled despite the pain, the day she told him she loved him, the last day, the final breath, the unbearable silence that followed. As Michael spoke, tears streamed down his face, not because he was weak, because he was finally allowing himself to remember. For years he had avoided that memory. He had locked it away, hidden it behind distractions. But now it stood before him, raw, painful, real. When he finally finished speaking, the fire crackled softly between them. The monk remained silent for several moments. Then he asked a question. Would you erase that pain if you could? Michael frowned. What? If you could remove all the pain of losing Sarah, would you? The answer seemed obvious. Of course he would. Wouldn't he? Yet something stopped him, because removing the pain would mean removing something else. The years they shared, the memories, the love, the life they built together. Slowly, Michael shook his head. No. The monk nodded gently. Why not? Michael stared into the flames. Then the answer appeared. Because the pain exists because the love existed. The monk smiled. A warm, knowing smile. Exactly. The old monk picked up a small piece of wood and placed it into the fire. The flames immediately grew brighter. Most people believe pain is proof that something went wrong. He watched the fire carefully, but often pain is proof that something mattered. Michael felt those words settle deep inside him. The monk continued. The loss hurts because the love was real. The grief hurts because the connection was real. The wound hurts because your heart was open. The fire crackled softly. And what is wrong with that? Michael looked down. For years, he had treated his grief like an enemy. Something to overcome. Something to defeat. Something to escape. But what if grief wasn't the enemy? What if grief was simply love with nowhere to go? The thought stunned him. The monk leaned forward. Michael, pain is not always punishment. Sometimes it is preparation. The words lingered in the cold mountain air. Preparation for what? The monk smiled. For becoming someone deeper than you were before. Michael listened carefully. The monk pointed toward the forest. Do you see those trees? Michael nodded. They became strong because they survived storms. He pointed toward the mountains. The mountains became beautiful because time carved them. Then he placed a hand over his own heart. And people become wise because life breaks them open. The word struck Michael with unexpected force, because every painful experience in his life had changed him. Some had made him stronger. Some had made him kinder. Some had taught him compassion. Yet he had spent years wishing none of it had happened, fighting against the lessons life was trying to teach him. The monk's voice softened. The goal is not to avoid suffering. The goal is to let suffering transform you. Michael sat silently, watching the flames, thinking about Sarah, thinking about loss, thinking about all the ways pain had shaped his life. For the first time, he stopped asking why she died. Instead, he asked something different. How can I honor what her life taught me? The question felt different, lighter, wiser, more peaceful. The monk slowly stood. Before walking away, he offered one final thought. The wound is where the light enters. Then he disappeared into the mist, leaving Michael alone beside the fire. The flames danced quietly before him, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he did not feel broken. He felt changed. There was a difference, a very important difference. Broken things remain broken, but transformed things become something new. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Michael realized something he had never understood before. His pain had not come to destroy him. It had come to awaken him. And perhaps his journey was only beginning. The next few days passed quietly. Michael helped around the temple. Nothing complicated. Sweeping leaves, watering plants, carrying firewood. Simple tasks. Tasks he would have considered meaningless just a week ago. Yet somehow they brought him peace. One afternoon, while stacking logs near a small shed, Michael noticed an old photograph hanging on the wall. It showed a much younger version of himself. Not literally, but it reminded him of who he used to be. Strong, ambitious, determined. The kind of man who always had a plan. The kind of man who always knew what came next. For a long moment, he stared at the image. Then a strange thought entered his mind. When was the last time I actually lived for myself? That evening, he sat with the monk beside a lantern glowing softly in the darkness. The mountains were silent. The stars stretched endlessly overhead. The monk poured tea into 2 small cups. Neither spoke immediately. Eventually, Michael broke the silence. I spent my whole life trying to be a good man. The monk nodded. That is admirable. Michael stared into his tea. Was it? The monk raised an eyebrow. Michael sighed. I worked overtime because I wanted my family to have everything. I said yes when I wanted to say no. I ignored my own dreams. I did what everyone expected. The word surprised even him. They had been buried for decades. I always thought that's what a good man was supposed to do. The monk listened quietly. Michael continued. My father expected me to be responsible. My boss expected me to work harder. My family needed me. My community respected me. So I became whatever everyone needed. The old monk remained silent. Then he asked softly, and who did Michael need? The question hit him harder than expected. Michael looked away. The answer was obvious. No one had ever asked, including himself. For years he had focused on everyone else's needs, everyone else's expectations, everyone else's approval, but his own heart, his own dreams, his own happiness, those things had always come last. The monk sipped his tea. There is a difference between kindness and self-abandonment. Michael frowned. What do you mean? The monk smiled gently. Many people spend their lives wearing masks. The good employee, the perfect parent, the reliable friend, the successful provider. The old monk pointed toward Michael. They play these roles so long that eventually they forget who is underneath them. A cold realization moved through Michael. Because that was exactly what had happened. He had spent decades becoming useful, necessary, dependable. Yet somewhere along the way, he had lost contact with himself. Not intentionally, slowly, quietly, year after year. The monk continued. Tell me, Michael, if nobody expected anything from you, if nobody judged you, if nobody needed your approval, who would you be? Michael opened his mouth, then stopped, because he honestly didn't know. The realization frightened him. 68 years old, and he didn't know who he truly was. The monk seemed unsurprised. Most people never ask that question. Why? Because they are afraid of the answer. The lantern flickered gently. The mountain air felt cool against Michael's skin. For several minutes, he sat quietly, thinking, remembering, questioning. Then memories began surfacing. Dreams he had abandoned, places he wanted to visit, books he wanted to write, adventures he postponed, passions he buried beneath responsibility. Not because they weren't important, because there was always something more urgent, something more practical, something more expected. The monk's voice interrupted his thoughts. The Buddha taught that attachment creates suffering. Michael nodded. He had heard that before. But there's another attachment many people never notice. What is it? The monk looked directly into his eyes. Attachment to the identity you think you must be. Silence. Deep silence. Michael felt something inside him shift. Because for decades he had been attached to being the provider. The strong one. The dependable one. The one who never struggled. The one who always had answers. And when retirement came, when Sarah passed away, when his children built lives of their own, those identities disappeared. And without them, he felt lost. Not because he had lost himself, because he had mistaken the role for the person. The monk smiled softly. You are not your job. You are not your title. You are not your successes. You are not your failures. You are not even the stories you tell yourself. Michael sat completely still, listening. The monk pointed toward the stars above. Before the world told you who to be, who were you? The question lingered long after the conversation ended. Later that night, Michael stood alone beneath the vast Colorado sky. The stars seemed brighter than he remembered. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what others expected. He wasn't worrying about being useful. He wasn't trying to earn anyone's approval. He simply stood there, breathing, existing, being, and somewhere deep within him, a forgotten part of himself began waking up. Not the husband, not the father, not the provider, just Michael, the man beneath all the roles, the man he had not seen in decades. And for the first time in a very long time, he wanted to meet him. A week had passed since Michael arrived at the temple. For the first time in years, he felt lighter. Not happy, not healed, but lighter. The crushing weight he had carried for so long no longer felt impossible to bear. The mornings felt calmer. The nights felt quieter. His thoughts no longer raced endlessly. And then the phone rang. It happened just after breakfast. Michael had almost forgotten he even owned a phone. The screen displayed a familiar name. David, his son. A small smile appeared on Michael's face. He answered immediately. Son. There was a pause. Then David's voice. Hey, Dad. The conversation began normally. Questions about health. Questions about the temple. Questions about how long Michael planned to stay. Then something shifted. David sounded distracted, rushed, as if his mind was somewhere else. Finally he said, Listen, Dad, I probably won't be able to visit this summer. Silence. Michael felt something tighten inside his chest. Oh, we've got a lot going on. I understand. And he did understand. At least part of him did. But another part felt something much older, much deeper. The conversation ended a few minutes later. Nothing dramatic. No argument. No harsh words. Just disappointment. The familiar kind. The kind that had visited him many times over the years. Michael slipped the phone into his pocket, then walked away from the temple. Alone. Faster than usual. His breathing became heavier. His jaw tightened. The old emotions returned with surprising force. Anger. Hurt. Resentment. Loneliness. All of it. He reached a trail overlooking the valley below. And suddenly the thoughts began. He doesn't care. I'm not important anymore. Nobody needs me. Nobody has time for me. The same stories. The same wounds. The same pain. Again and again. By the time he returned to the temple hours later, his mood had darkened completely. The monk was sitting beneath the pine tree, waiting, almost as if he knew. Michael dropped onto the bench, frustrated, exhausted. I thought I was making progress. The monk looked at him calmly. You are. No. Michael shook his head. Everything came back. The anger, the disappointment, the loneliness. I thought I was past this. The monk listened carefully. Then he asked, did the storm return? Michael frowned. What? The monk pointed toward the mountains. Dark clouds were gathering in the distance. Do you believe the sky becomes the storm? Michael stared at him. No. The storm passes through the sky. The monk nodded. Exactly. For a moment, Michael remained silent. Then understanding slowly began to emerge. The monk continued. You think your emotions are proof that you have failed. But emotions are weather. They come. They stay. They leave. The old monk's eyes remained gentle. The problem is not that you feel anger. The problem is that you become anger. Michael looked down. The monk was right. The moment disappointment appeared, he had become it. The moment loneliness appeared, he had surrendered to it. The moment anger arrived, it controlled him completely. The monk picked up a fallen leaf. Tell me what happened today. Michael explained everything. The phone call, the disappointment, the hurt, the familiar feeling of being forgotten. When he finished, the monk nodded. David's words caused pain. Michael agreed. But your thoughts created suffering. The statement immediately irritated him. What's that supposed to mean? The monk smiled. It means the event lasted 5 minutes. He pointed toward Michael's chest. But the story has been repeating for hours. Silence. Painful silence. Because it was true. The conversation had ended long ago. Yet Michael had replayed it hundreds of times, adding new meanings, new assumptions, new fears. The monk continued. You are not suffering from the phone call. You are suffering from the story you attached to it. The word struck deep. Michael suddenly saw it. The story. His son doesn't care. I am forgotten. I'm alone. I'm not important. None of those things had actually been said. They were conclusions, interpretations, old wounds speaking through a new situation. The monk gently placed the leaf on the ground. When anger appears, observe it. When sadness appears, observe it. When fear appears, observe it. Michael listened carefully. The monk pointed toward the sky. You're the sky. The emotions are the weather. Never confuse the two. For the first time that day, Michael felt himself breathe deeply. Something loosened inside him. The monk smiled. This is the 6th lesson. What is it? Become the observer, not the reactor. The mountains stood silent around them. The wind moved softly through the trees. Michael closed his eyes, and there it was. The anger, still present. The disappointment, still present. The loneliness, still present. Yet somehow they felt different now, because for the first time, he wasn't drowning inside them. He was simply watching them, like clouds drifting across a wide, open sky. And for the first time in many years, Michael realized something extraordinary. He was not his pain. He was the one witnessing it. And that realization changed everything. The next morning arrived with an unusual stillness. The mountains seemed quieter, the wind gentler. Even the birds appeared to sing more softly. Michael stood outside the small guest house with a travel bag resting beside his feet. He had made a decision. It was time to go home. After all, he had already stayed longer than planned. He had learned valuable lessons, found moments of peace, faced memories he had spent years avoiding. Surely that was enough, or so he thought. As he prepared to leave, the old monk appeared from the garden, carrying 2 cups of tea. The monk glanced at the travel bag, then smiled. "So?" Michael nodded. "So?" The monk handed him a cup. Neither spoke for a while. They simply stood together watching the morning sunlight slowly touch the mountain peaks. Finally, the monk asked, "Are you returning home?" Michael smiled faintly. "I think so." The monk took a slow sip of tea. "And what is waiting for you there?" The question seemed simple. Yet Michael found himself hesitating. The house, the photographs, the silence, the empty chair beside the fireplace, the same routine, the same loneliness, the same questions. For a moment, he wasn't sure how to answer. The monk noticed, then quietly said, "Tell me something, Michael. When did you decide that being alone meant something was wrong?" Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" The monk sat on a nearby wooden bench. Most people fear loneliness more than almost anything. They fear it more than failure, more than uncertainty, sometimes even more than death. Michael sat beside him because he knew the monk was talking about him. For years he had feared being alone. After Sarah died, every empty room felt unbearable. Every quiet evening felt like punishment. Every holiday reminded him of what he had lost. The monk continued, "But loneliness and solitude are not the same thing." Michael listened carefully. Loneliness says. The monk paused. "Something important is missing." Then he placed a hand over his heart. But solitude says, "Everything important is already here." Michael stared at the mountains. The words settled deep within him. The monk smiled gently. "When you first arrived, you believed your suffering came from being alone." Michael nodded. "I did. But was that true?" For a long moment, Michael thought about it. Then something surprising happened. He realized the worst moments of his life hadn't happened when he was alone. Some had happened in crowded rooms. Some had happened while surrounded by people. Some had happened during family gatherings. Some had happened at work. His suffering had not come from physical isolation. It came from disconnection. Disconnection from himself. The monk seemed pleased. "You see it now?" Michael slowly nodded. The old monk leaned back. Then for the first time since they met, he began speaking about his own life. "When I was a young man." Michael looked surprised. The monk rarely spoke about himself. "I had a family." Michael blinked. "A family?" The monk smiled. "Yes. A wife. A daughter. A normal life." The revelation stunned Michael. The monk looked toward the distant mountains. Then one winter, an accident changed everything. His voice remained calm, yet there was sadness beneath it. "My wife and daughter never came home." Silence. Deep silence. Michael felt his chest tighten. For the first time, he understood. This man knew loss, not as a philosophy, not as a teaching, but as a lived experience. The monk continued quietly. "For years I believed life had abandoned me. I felt betrayed, alone, broken." His eyes reflected memories from long ago. "Then one day I realized something." "What?" The monk smiled. "I had spent years mourning the people I lost, but I had never met the person who remained. Michael felt those words like a bell ringing inside his soul. The monk looked directly at him. The greatest relationship of your life is not with a spouse, not with a child, not with a friend. It is with yourself. The wind moved softly through the pine trees. The mountains stood silent around them. Michael felt tears forming again, not tears of grief. Something different. Understanding. The monk pointed toward the travel bag. You can return home today if you wish. Then he smiled. But don't return as the man who arrived here. Michael looked down. The truth was undeniable. The man who arrived at the temple had been afraid of silence, afraid of loneliness, afraid of himself. That man believed peace existed somewhere outside of him. Now something had changed. Not completely, but enough. Enough to see that peace had never been missing. It had simply been buried beneath years of fear and noise. The monk stood. Before walking away, he offered one final lesson. The seventh lesson. Michael waited. The monk smiled warmly. Learn to enjoy your own company. Because when you become a friend to yourself, you are never truly alone. Then he disappeared down the stone path, leaving Michael sitting beneath the endless Colorado sky. For a long time, he remained there, watching the clouds drift across the mountains, feeling the breeze against his face, listening to the quiet. And for the first time in many years, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like home. The following morning, Michael woke before sunrise. No alarm, no schedule, no reason. Yet something inside him had changed. For years, mornings had been difficult. He would wake up and immediately think about the past, about Sarah, about mistakes, about opportunities missed, about the years that could never return. The past greeted him before the sun did. And when it wasn't the past, it was the future. What if my health gets worse? What if I become a burden? What if I spend the rest of my life alone? His mind rarely stayed where his body was. It was always somewhere else. Yesterday, tomorrow, anywhere but here. This morning felt different. As the first light appeared over the mountains, Michael stepped outside and began walking through the temple grounds. The world was waking slowly. Dew rested on the grass. Birds moved between the trees. The cool air carried the scent of pine. Everything felt alive. And for some reason, Michael noticed it all. Not because the world had changed, because he had. As he followed a narrow trail through the forest, he found the monk sitting beside a small stream. The old man seemed perfectly content, doing absolutely nothing, watching water flow over stones, listening, breathing, existing. Michael sat beside him. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Michael smiled. "What are you doing?" The monk laughed softly. Watching the stream. Michael waited. Surely there was more. But there wasn't. The monk was genuinely just watching the stream. Nothing else. No goal. No task. No destination. Just presence. The simplicity felt almost ridiculous. Then the monk asked, "Where were you yesterday?" Michael frowned. "Here." The monk shook his head. "No. You were thinking about Sarah." Michael lowered his eyes. That was true. The monk continued. "And where were you last week?" Michael already knew. Thinking about the future. The monk nodded. "Exactly." Then he pointed toward the flowing water. "Tell me where this stream is." Michael looked confused. "Right here." The monk smiled. "And where is your life?" The answer seemed obvious. Yet suddenly it wasn't, because Michael realized something shocking. His body had spent years in the present, but his mind had not. His mind lived in memories, regrets, worries, imagined futures, endless mental journeys that never actually happened. The monk picked up a leaf and placed it gently into the water. They watched it float downstream. You cannot touch yesterday. The monk's voice was calm. You cannot live tomorrow. The leaf disappeared around a bend. But you can live this moment. The words seemed simple, yet Michael felt their weight, because he had spent years postponing life, waiting for things to improve, waiting to feel better, waiting to become happy again, waiting for some future version of himself to finally begin living. Meanwhile, the present moment kept slipping away. Day after day, year after year, the monk continued. Most people sacrifice today for a tomorrow that never arrives. The stream flowed peacefully beside them. Michael thought about retirement. How many years he had spent saying, "When work slows down, I'll enjoy life." Then work ended, and still he didn't enjoy life. Then he thought about grief. For years he had told himself, "When the pain goes away, I'll be at peace." But peace had never arrived, because he kept placing it somewhere in the future, always ahead, never here. The monk suddenly asked, "What if this moment is enough?" Michael looked at him. "What do you mean? What if nothing needs to be added?" The old monk gestured around them. The mountains, the stream, the breath in your lungs, the sunlight touching the trees. What if life is already happening? Michael fell silent, because deep inside he knew the answer. Life had always been happening. He was simply absent for much of it, lost in memories, lost in fears, lost in stories. The monk stood and stretched slowly. The 8th lesson. Michael listened carefully. Do not miss today while mourning yesterday or fearing tomorrow. The words settled deep within him. For a long time after the monk left, Michael remained beside the stream, watching the water move, listening to the forest, feeling his breath. Nothing extraordinary happened. No miracle. No sudden enlightenment. Yet something beautiful unfolded. For perhaps the first time in decades, Michael stopped trying to be somewhere else. He stopped wishing for another moment, another year, another life. He simply sat beside the stream and allowed this moment to be enough. The sunlight grew warmer. The birds continued singing. The water continued flowing. And Michael smiled, a real smile, not because his problems were gone, not because the past had changed, not because the future was certain, but because for the first time in a very long while, he was finally here. The days passed quietly. Michael no longer counted them. There was something comforting about life at the temple. The simplicity, the rhythm, the absence of urgency. For the first time in many years, he wasn't trying to get somewhere. He wasn't chasing anything. And yet, despite all the peace he had begun to discover, one weight still remained. A hidden weight, one he rarely spoke about, one he barely admitted to himself. It appeared late one evening. The sky was painted with shades of purple and gold. Michael sat alone outside the guest house, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. Without warning, a memory surfaced. Sarah's final week. A particular conversation, one he had tried very hard to forget. She had been lying in her hospital bed, weak, tired, barely able to speak. Yet somehow she had still managed to smile. Michael remembered holding her hand, trying to be strong, trying not to cry. Then she had looked at him and whispered something. Promise me something. He had leaned closer. Anything. Her eyes had softened. When I'm gone, the memory tightened his chest. Don't stop living. Michael closed his eyes. Even now, years later, the words hurt. Because he had broken that promise. Completely. After she died, he had not lived. He had survived. There was a difference. A huge difference. For years, he blamed himself for that. Blamed himself for not being stronger. For not recovering faster. For wasting so much time. For becoming someone Sarah would hardly recognize. The guilt lived quietly inside him. Like a shadow, always present, never fully seen. The following morning, the monk found Michael sitting alone near the garden. He immediately sensed something was wrong. You look heavy. Michael forced a smile. I've carried heavier. The monk sat beside him. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Michael finally said, I think I've forgiven everyone. The monk nodded. Everyone. My father. My old boss. The doctors. Life. The monk smiled softly. And yourself? Silence. Immediate silence. Michael looked away. The monk already had his answer. For several moments, neither spoke. Then the old monk asked quietly, What are you still punishing yourself for? The question pierced straight through him. Memories rushed forward. Moments he wished he could change. Mistakes. Regrets. Failures. Things he should have said. Things he shouldn't have said. Decisions he wished he could undo. Years of accumulated guilt. Michael stared at the ground. I should have done better. The monk nodded. According to whom? Myself. The monk smiled sadly. Then perhaps you are the harshest judge in your life. The words landed heavily. Because they were true. Michael had shown compassion to almost everyone. Friends. Family. Strangers. Yet when it came to himself, there was only criticism. Only judgment. Only blame. The monk picked up a small branch from the ground. Then he drew a circle in the dirt. Imagine this circle is your entire life. Michael watched quietly. The monk placed a tiny pebble inside. This pebble is every mistake you've ever made. Then he looked at Michael. Why have you convinced yourself the pebble is larger than the circle? Michael felt his throat tighten. Because that was exactly what he had done. He remembered every failure, every regret, every weakness. Yet somehow forgot decades of love, decades of sacrifice, decades of kindness. The monk continued, You judge yourself by your wounds, but other people remember your heart. The words struck something deep inside him. Michael thought about Sarah. What would she say if she were sitting here? Would she condemn him? Would she shame him? Would she tell him he had failed? Of course not. She would probably smile, take his hand, and remind him he was human. The realization brought tears to his eyes. The monk noticed, then gently asked, If Sarah could speak to you right now, what would she say? Michael couldn't answer immediately. His eyes filled, his chest tightened. Finally, he whispered, She'd tell me to stop carrying all this. The monk nodded. Then why don't you listen? The question shattered something inside him. Not painfully, liberating. For years he had carried guilt because he believed it honored the past. But perhaps it didn't. Perhaps it only imprisoned the present. The wind moved softly through the garden. The monk placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. The 9th lesson. Michael wiped his eyes. The monk smiled gently. Forgiveness is not something you give only to others. It is something you finally allow yourself to receive. For a long time, neither spoke. They simply sat together, listening to the breeze, watching the sunlight move across the grass. And for the first time in many years, Michael stopped arguing with his past, stopped punishing himself, stopped demanding perfection from a human life. Instead, he quietly whispered words he never thought he would say. I forgive you. Not to another person, not to the world, not even to fate, but to the man he'd been fighting all these years. Himself. And as those words settled into the silence, something extraordinary happened. The weight he had carried for so long became just a little lighter. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Michael felt free. Autumn was slowly giving way to winter. The mountains around the temple had begun to change. The vibrant colors of the leaves were fading. The mornings were colder now, the days shorter. Everywhere Michael looked, nature seemed to be letting go. One afternoon, he found himself standing beneath a large maple tree near the edge of the temple grounds. Golden leaves drifted through the air. One by one, slowly, gracefully, without resistance. Michael watched them fall. Something about the sight felt strangely beautiful and strangely sad. The monk appeared beside him. Neither spoke for a while. They simply watched the leaves. Finally, Michael broke the silence. Do you ever get used to losing things? The monk looked at him carefully. What do you mean? Michael shrugged. People, time, health, youth. He hesitated. Life. The monk smiled softly. For a moment, the old man simply watched another leaf float toward the ground. Then he asked, do you think that leaf is failing? Michael looked confused. What? The monk pointed toward the falling leaf. Do you think it should stay on the branch forever? No. Why not? Because that's not how nature works. The monk nodded. Exactly. Then he looked directly at Michael. So why do you expect life to work differently? The question settled heavily between them. The wind carried another wave of leaves across the ground. Michael felt something stir inside him, because he had spent years resisting change, resisting aging, resisting loss, resisting reality itself. Sarah wasn't supposed to die. His children weren't supposed to move away. His body wasn't supposed to grow older. Life wasn't supposed to change. At least, that's what part of him believed. The monk slowly sat on a nearby stone bench. Everything you love will change. The words sounded harsh, yet the monk's voice carried no sadness. Only truth. Every season, every relationship, every possession, every body, every life. Michael sat beside him. The old monk continued, this is not a mistake. This is the way existence works. The mountains stood silently around them, ancient, timeless, yet even they were changing, slowly, moment by moment, year by year. The monk picked up a fallen leaf, holding it carefully between his fingers. Most people suffer because they demand permanence from an impermanent world. Michael felt those words deeply, because they described his entire struggle. He had wanted things to stay the same, wanted happiness to remain forever, wanted loved ones to remain forever, wanted youth to remain forever. But nothing remains forever. Nothing. The monk released the leaf. The wind carried it away. Impermanence is not what makes life painful. Michael listened carefully. Impermanence is what makes life precious. Silence. Deep silence. The words seemed to echo through the forest. Suddenly Michael thought about Sarah, and for the first time, a different perspective appeared. What made their years together beautiful wasn't that they lasted forever. It was that they didn't. Their time had been limited, and because it was limited, it mattered. Every laugh, every conversation, every ordinary moment, all of it had value because it would eventually end. Tears filled his eyes, but they were different tears now. Not grief. Gratitude. The monk smiled. You see it. Michael nodded slowly. For the first time, he did. The old monk continued. When you truly understand impermanence, you stop clinging. You stop demanding. You stop fighting life. Instead, you begin appreciating. The wind moved gently through the trees. The afternoon sunlight painted the mountains in shades of gold. Michael suddenly noticed details he might once have ignored. The warmth of the sun, the scent of pine, the sound of leaves moving across the earth. Simple things, beautiful things, temporary things. The monk looked toward the horizon. One day this body will be gone. His voice remained peaceful. One day your body will be gone. Michael swallowed. Strangely, the statement didn't frighten him. Not anymore. The monk smiled. And that is exactly why this moment matters. For years Michael had feared death. Not openly, not consciously, but beneath many of his worries lived that fear. The fear of endings, the fear of losing, the fear of disappearing. Now something had changed, not because he wanted life to end, but because he finally understood that endings were never the enemy. They were part of the dance, part of the beauty, part of what made every moment meaningful. The monk stood, then turned toward Michael. The 10th lesson. Michael looked up. The old monk smiled warmly. Do not fear change. Fear missing the beauty that change reveals. The words settled into Michael's heart. And as another golden leaf drifted gently from the tree above them, he watched it fall all the way to the ground. Not with sadness, not with resistance, but with appreciation. Because for the first time in his life, he understood something simple. Nothing lasts forever. And that is exactly what makes life so beautiful. Winter arrived quietly. The mountains were covered in a thin blanket of snow. The pine trees stood tall beneath the pale morning sky. Everything seemed slower now, stiller, almost timeless. Michael had been at the temple for several weeks, long enough to notice something remarkable. The world around him had not changed. His wife was still gone. His children still lived far away. His body was still aging. Life was still uncertain. And yet, he felt different, not because his problems had disappeared, because something inside him had changed. One evening, as the sun faded beyond the mountains, Michael found the monk sitting alone near the highest point of the temple grounds. The old man was doing nothing, simply sitting, eyes half closed, breathing. Michael sat beside him. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable now, like an old friend. Finally, Michael smiled. Can I ask you something? The monk opened his eyes. Of course. Michael hesitated. After everything, he looked toward the distant mountains. After all the lessons, after all the years, how do you stay peaceful? The monk smiled softly, then pointed toward Michael's chest. What are you doing right now? Michael looked confused. Sitting. The monk shook his head. No. Michael thought for a moment. Breathing? The monk nodded. Exactly. The answer seemed too simple, almost disappointing. Michael laughed. That's it. The monk laughed too. That is everything. The wind moved gently around them. The old monk looked toward the horizon. Most people spend their lives searching for peace. They search in success, in money, in relationships, in achievements. He paused. But peace is not hiding. We are. Michael listened carefully. The monk continued. Your mind lives in the past, or the future. It races endlessly. And then people wonder why they cannot find peace. The old man smiled. Peace is always here. He tapped the ground beneath them. Only your attention is somewhere else. The words felt familiar, yet deeper now. The monk slowly closed his eyes. Take a breath. Michael obeyed. A slow inhale. Cold mountain air filling his lungs. Now exhale. He did. The tension in his shoulders softened. The monk spoke quietly. Again, another breath. Another exhale. The world seemed to slow down. The old monk continued. Notice something. What? There is no fear in this breath. Michael frowned slightly, then realized it was true. The fear lived in thoughts. The worries lived in thoughts. The regrets lived in thoughts. But this breath, this moment, contained none of them. Only presence. Only life. The monk smiled. The breath cannot exist yesterday. It cannot exist tomorrow. It only exists now. Michael sat silently, listening, feeling, understanding. For years he had searched everywhere for peace. Yet every time he became fully present, every time he simply breathed, a small piece of peace appeared naturally. Not because he created it, because it had always been there, hidden beneath the noise. The monk's voice became softer. When Sarah died, you lost someone you loved. Michael nodded. When your children moved away, you experienced loneliness. Another nod. When you grew older, you faced uncertainty. The monk smiled gently. And through all of it, he pointed toward Michael's chest. What remained? Michael closed his eyes, listening, feeling. Then he understood. The breath. Every sorrow, every joy, every loss, every triumph. His breath had been there through all of it, patiently, quietly, faithfully, waiting for him to notice. Tears formed in Michael's eyes, not from sadness, for gratitude. The monk continued. This is the final lesson. Michael listened. When life becomes overwhelming, return to the breath. When fear appears, return to the breath. When grief visits, return to the breath. When happiness arrives, return to the breath. The old monk smiled, because every journey away from yourself ends the same way. Michael whispered, Where? The monk looked at him with warm eyes. Right here. The snow-covered mountains glowed beneath the last light of day. The world seemed impossibly beautiful, not because it was perfect, because Michael was finally present enough to see it. For a long time, neither man spoke. They simply sat together, breathing, inhaling, exhaling, nothing more, nothing less. And for the first time in his life, Michael understood that peace was never something he needed to chase. It was something he needed to remember, something that had been waiting inside him all along, hidden in the simplest thing imaginable. A single breath. The morning Michael left the temple was clear and bright. Fresh snow covered the mountain peaks. The air was crisp. The sky stretched endlessly above him. His old pickup truck waited near the entrance, just as it had the day he arrived. Yet something felt different. Weeks earlier, he had driven up that mountain carrying grief, regret, loneliness, and questions he could not answer. Now, he carried something else. Not certainty, not perfection, not even complete healing. Something far more valuable. Peace. Before leaving, Michael found a monk standing near the temple gate. Neither man said much. There was no need. Some connections exist beyond words. The monk smiled. Are you ready? Michael looked toward the road leading home, then back toward the temple. Finally, he nodded. Yes. The old monk placed a hand on his shoulder. Remember. Michael waited. Life will still challenge you. The monk's eyes were kind. There will still be loss. There will still be uncertainty. There will still be difficult days. Michael nodded. He understood now. Peace did not mean a life without storms. It meant learning how to stand calmly within them. The monk smiled one last time, then stepped back. Go live. Those two simple words followed Michael all the way down the mountain. Go live. Not survive. Not endure. Live. The drive home felt shorter somehow. The familiar roads no longer felt empty. The passing trees no longer seemed ordinary. Even the winter sunlight looked different. Or perhaps Michael was seeing it differently. Hours later, he turned into his driveway. The house stood exactly as he had left it. The porch, the windows, the old mailbox. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had changed. Michael stepped out of the truck. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking, breathing, listening. The same house that once felt like a prison now felt strangely peaceful. He opened the front door. The familiar scent greeted him. The photographs still sat on the shelves. Sarah's favorite coffee mug still rested beside the sink. The old clock still hung on the wall. Everything remained exactly where it had been. Months ago, seeing these things would have shattered him. Today they brought a gentle smile. Not because the pain had disappeared, because the love remained. That evening, as the sun began to set, Michael walked onto the porch. The old rocking chair waited in its usual place. The same chair where the story had begun. Slowly he sat down. The chair creaked softly beneath him. The mountains glowed gold in the distance. A cold breeze moved through the trees. For a long time he simply watched. No television. No distractions. No need to escape. Just this moment. Just this breath. Just this life. His eyes drifted toward the empty chair beside him. The chair Sarah used to occupy. For a brief moment, sadness appeared, but something else appeared beside it. Gratitude. He thought about their years together. The laughter. The struggles. The ordinary days that once seemed unimportant. The love. Especially the love. And for the first time since her passing, he did not focus on how the story ended. He focused on how beautiful it had been. A gentle smile touched his face. The wind moved softly across the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang. And then something remarkable happened. Nothing. No miracle. No vision. No dramatic revelation. Only stillness. Only peace. The kind of peace he had spent years searching for. The kind of peace he believed had disappeared forever. Yet here it was. Not hidden in the mountains. Not hidden in the temple. Not hidden inside the monk's teachings. It had been inside him all along. Waiting patiently beneath the noise. Waiting beneath the grief. Waiting beneath the fear. Waiting for him to return. As darkness slowly settled over the landscape, Michael took a deep breath. Then another. The same breath that had carried him through childhood, through marriage, through heartbreak, through loss, Through every chapter of his life, for the first time, he truly appreciated it. He appreciated this moment, this life, this imperfect, beautiful, temporary life. The stars began appearing one by one above the mountains. Michael looked upward. A feeling of quiet wonder filled his heart, not because he finally had all the answers, because he no longer needed them. Life would continue to change. People would come and go. Seasons would pass. One day his own journey would end. But tonight was not that night. Tonight he was alive. Tonight he was present. Tonight he was at peace. And somehow that was enough. More than enough. As the porch light glowed softly behind him and the mountains faded into darkness, Michael closed his eyes and smiled. Not the smile of a man who had escaped suffering. The smile of a man who had finally made peace with life. And in that quiet moment, beneath the vast Colorado sky, he understood the deepest lesson of all. You do not find yourself by chasing the world. You find yourself when you finally stop running. And when you do, you discover that peace was never far away. It was simply waiting for you to come home. The end.